The last of the mourners had left the hillside, their wagon wheels fading into the distance, leaving Daniel Hale alone by the fresh mound of earth. He stood with his hat in his hands, the brim damp with sweat, the autumn wind sharp against his face. His brother's name was carved into the wooden cross, plain and rough. Nothing more than Daniel could manage with the tools at hand. He whispered a quiet word, though his throat burned too much to say more, then turned his boots down the slope toward town. The sun was falling low, smearing the Montana sky in streaks of crimson and gold, a cruel beauty on a day of loss. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the land itself knew he carried more sorrow than a man should bear. By the time he reached the street of the small town, dust already swirled in the cooling air. The stage wagon rattled in from the east, wheels clattering over hard ground, its shadow long against the dying light. Daniel meant to pass it by, head bent, but the driver pulled up with a crack of the reins and called for help unloading a passenger. Daniel stopped, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat. The door swung open and a woman stepped down slowly, one hand clutching a small satchel pressed against her skirts. She was young, though her face carried a tiredness that spoke of years lived hard. Her dress was plain, hem ragged from travel, and around her neck hung a small locket that caught the last light like a spark. Her eyes searched the ground as if bracing for pity. She held herself stiff, shoulders drawn tight, and when her gaze lifted to Daniel, she seemed ready for rejection, as though she had learned to expect little else. He felt something twist in his chest, a recognition of the same emptiness he carried inside himself. The driver muttered something about her having no kin, nowhere else to go, and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Daniel looked at her again, at the way she clutched her satchel with white knuckles, at the way her chin trembled but did not fall. He saw not weakness, but a fight to stand straight, even when the world pressed her low. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from silence. "You can come with me, ma'am," he said quietly. "The cabin's plain, but it will keep the wind off you." She blinked, surprise flickering in her eyes, then nodded once, her lips parting as though to thank him, but no words came. He reached for her satchel before she could protest, the weight light in his hand, as though she carried all her life in that one bag. Together they walked down the road, his stride slow to match hers. The townfolk watched from porches and windows, whispers curling in the cooling air, but Daniel kept his eyes forward. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in burning red, and in that strange, quiet moment, two wounded souls stepped side by side into a future neither had expected. The cabin sat low against the pines, its roof patched with fresh shingles that still smelled of tar, its walls plain but sturdy against the chill of Montana nights. When Daniel pushed the door open, Evelyn stepped inside with her satchel clutched close, her eyes moving quick across the bare room. The space was simple. One narrow bed against the wall, a wooden table, two chairs, and a stone hearth where the ashes of old fires lay cold. She did not shrink from the plainness. Instead, she set her satchel down with quiet resolve, as though claiming the cabin not as charity, but as a place she meant to fill with her own strength. Daniel stood awkward in the doorway, hat in hand, unsure of the right words, so he only muttered that she could take the bed while he would make do with the cot in the corner. The days that followed unfolded like the slow turn of a wheel, steady and without fuss. Daniel left at dawn, his horse's hooves striking the frozen earth as he rode the ridges on long patrols, watching for drifters or cattle thieves, anything that might trouble the town. Evelyn stayed behind, her figure moving quiet through the cabin, sweeping the dust from corners, patching the thin curtains with scraps of cloth, and coaxing the old stove to life. She cooked with what little there was, beans simmering with salt pork, bread baked from coarse flour, and though the meals were simple, the cabin began to carry the smell of comfort instead of emptiness. Daniel noticed the changes, though he said little. At night, when he returned, tired from the saddle, the light of the lantern spilled from the window, and the air inside was warmer than he remembered. Evelyn set plates before him without complaint, her hand steady even when her face looked worn. She did not ask for thanks, and he offered little, Yet something in the quiet passing of bread and coffee felt more binding than words. He watched the way she straightened her shoulders when she carried wood, the way she pressed her lips firm when the kettle was heavy, and he realized she did not want to be pitied. She wanted to be seen. Silence filled the cabin most evenings, broken only by the crackle of firewood or the scrape of cutlery. Daniel kept his gaze on the flames, unsure how to reach beyond duty, while Evelyn stitched at her hem or polished the locket at her throat. Yet beneath that silence, an understanding stirred. He found himself lingering longer at the table, listening to the faint hum she made while sewing. She found herself noting the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to the horse outside, softer than the one he used for the town. The bond that grew between them was not born of warmth, not yet, but of necessity, of two people learning to share space and burden without complaint. Still, in the pause between one breath and the next, both felt the air shift, as if the cabin itself held a promise neither dared name. Morning came with the cry of roosters and the thin light of dawn spilling across the valley. Evelyn was already awake, her shawl pulled tight as she stepped into the yard to scatter grain for the hens. The chickens clucked and scratched at her boots while the cool air nipped her cheeks, and for the first time in many years, she felt the rhythm of simple work steadier than grief. She gathered eggs into her apron, careful not to crack them, and carried them back inside, where the stove already glowed with embers she had coaxed from last night's fire. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and though the walls were rough-hewn and the floor uneven, she began to think of it less as a stranger's dwelling, and more as a place she could shape with her hands. Daniel rode out each morning, his figure small against the vast sweep of pines and ridges. The sound of his horse's hooves faded, until silence wrapped the cabin again. Evelyn filled those hours with tasks that left no room for idleness. She scrubbed the table until the wood shone, stitched the fraying cuffs of Daniel's shirts with neat lines of thread, and hummed softly to herself while kneading bread dough. Her locket tapped gently against her chest as she worked, a quiet reminder of the child she had lost, yet the ache did not cut as sharply when her hands were busy. When the wind whistled through the chinks of the cabin walls, she stuffed them with cloth scraps, smiling faintly at the thought that the place no longer felt so drafty and empty. By dusk, her ears strained for the sound of hooves returning. The moment his boots struck the porch boards, a warmth spread through her chest that she would not name. Daniel entered tired, dust clinging to his coat, yet he always paused when the smell of fresh bread met him. She set the loaf on the table with a modest pride, and he lingered over it longer than he meant, chewing slowly, as though tasting not just bread, but the effort behind it. He found himself watching her as she brushed flour from her cheek, and one evening when she laughed at the streak across her nose, his lips almost curved into a smile before he caught himself. The nights grew softer than the days. After supper, Daniel mended tack by the fire while Evelyn sat with her sewing. Sometimes she dropped her needle, and he stooped to pick it up, their hands brushing just enough to leave silence hanging heavy between them. They did not speak of what stirred beneath the surface, but the air seemed to hold it, a fragile thread binding two lonely souls together. The cabin no longer felt hollow. The crackle of fire, the smell of bread, the sound of her quiet laughter stitched themselves into its walls. Neither dared admit it, not even to themselves, but life together had begun to take root, gentle and steady as the prairie grass in spring. The night was cool and still, the kind of night when the prairie seemed to hold its breath. A single lantern burned on the table, its glow casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Daniel sat with his chair tipped back slightly, boots resting on the worn planks, while Evelyn folded the day's sewing into a neat pile beside her. The silence between them was familiar by now, not uncomfortable, but heavy, as if both carried words they had not yet found the courage to share. The fire in the hearth had burned low, crackling soft, and the sound of crickets drifted in from the open window. Evelyn smoothed her skirt with steady hands. Though her heart beat uneven, she could feel Daniel's eyes on her, not pressing, not demanding, only waiting. At last she lifted her chin, the locket at her throat catching the lantern light. Her voice was soft, yet it carried a weight that filled the room. "I was married once," she said, the words tasting bitter, though she had rehearsed them 100 times in her mind. "My husband owed debts to men who would not forgive. He gambled away what little we had and borrowed more besides. When they came for him, he ran, leaving me with nothing but shame and a trail of threats." She paused, her fingers tightening in her lap. "He was shot down before I could find him, and the men he wronged turned to me as if I might pay what he never could. That is why I came west, not for hope, but because there was nowhere left for me." The words trembled, but once spoken they could not be taken back. She stared at the table, as if bracing for judgment. Daniel's jaw clenched, the muscle tight beneath his stubbled cheek. He did not look away from her, though his eyes darkened as he listened. After a long pause, he set his chair forward, elbows braced on his knees. "You think you're the only one carrying ghosts," he said quietly. "My brother died in my arms 2 years ago, shot down in the middle of the street. I was the sheriff, sworn to protect, but I failed him. Folks say it was the other man's bullet that killed him, but I know the truth. It was my hesitation, my mistake. If I'd drawn faster, if I'd stood closer, maybe he'd still be here." He swallowed hard, the lantern light catching the grief etched into the lines of his face. "That's a weight I'll never set down." Evelyn lifted her eyes, her breath catching at the rawness in his tone. The silence that followed was not the silence of strangers, but of two souls standing bare before one another. Slowly, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. His rough skin twitched at the touch, yet he did not pull away. For the first time since loss had carved them hollow, they were not alone in their burdens. Words had given shape to their pain, and in that fragile honesty, something new took root, steady and unspoken, binding them closer than either had dared hope. The storm rolled in from the mountains, with little warning, a wall of dark clouds swallowing the pale afternoon light. By evening, the wind shook the cabin walls, and rain lashed hard against the windows, drumming like fists on the roof. Daniel secured the shutters and stoked the fire higher, his shoulders broad in the flicker of flame. Evelyn sat near the hearth with a basket of mending at her feet, the lantern glowing steady at her side. The world outside was wild and fierce, but inside the cabin there was a sense of stillness, as if the storm had locked them together in a space too small for silence to hide everything. Daniel poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one before her. She curled her hands around the warm metal, the heat sinking into her chilled fingers. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady, and he nodded without looking at her, his jaw working as though unused to such small courtesies. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold, and for a moment he allowed himself to notice how the shadows deepened the curve of her cheek, how the locket at her throat glimmered when she leaned forward. He busied his hands with an old shirt, tearing away the frayed cuff and threading a needle, though his thoughts were less on the fabric and more on the woman sitting across from him. Evelyn tried not to watch him, but the steady sound of his breathing and the scrape of his boots against the floor gave her a strange comfort. The storm's howl no longer seemed so sharp when his voice broke through it, low and calm as he muttered about the stubborn thread. She smiled faintly, then laughed when he pricked his finger and swore under his breath. It was a small laugh, quick and unguarded, and Daniel lifted his head in surprise. He had not heard that sound in the cabin before. Her cheeks flushed, but she did not take it back, and when he caught the trace of humor in her eyes, he felt something loosen inside him. His lips curved into the smallest smile, awkward, but real. The hours stretched as the rain hammered down, yet neither minded. They passed the mending basket back and forth, sharing quiet jokes about crooked stitches, sipping coffee gone lukewarm, and listening to the storm rage beyond the walls. Evelyn found her hands trembling less when she worked beside him, as though his nearness steadied her. She listened for his voice each time he spoke, holding to it like a tether in the dark, and realized she had not felt this kind of safety in many years. Daniel, for his part, noticed how she leaned toward the sound of him, how the tension in her shoulders eased when he spoke. It stirred something fierce and tender in him all at once. By the time the storm began to soften, the fire had burned low, and both sat close, heads bent over the same patch of cloth, their hands brushing by accident and lingering a breath too long. The thunder still echoed across the valley, but inside the cabin there was only warmth, a bond growing quietly between them, undeniable as the dawn waiting beyond the storm. The leaves along the creek had turned brittle and gold, snapping in the wind like paper. Daniel rode into town with Evelyn seated beside him in the wagon, the wooden wheels groaning over ruts in the dirt road. The town looked the same as it always had, but the air felt different, heavier somehow. Eyes followed them as they passed, men leaning against posts and women pausing with baskets in hand, their voices dropping low when Daniel tipped his hat. Evelyn kept her gaze forward, her hands folded tight in her lap, though her stomach knotted with each whisper carried on the autumn breeze. Inside the general store, the smell of flour and leather oil filled the air. Daniel set a list of supplies on the counter, speaking in his steady tone, but Evelyn's ears caught more than his words. Near the shelves, two women lingered by the bolts of fabric, their voices sharp, though meant to be hushed. "That's her," one said, "the outlaw's widow. Poor sheriff doesn't know what shame he's tied himself to." The other clicked her tongue. "Cursed is what she island. A woman like that drags trouble behind her like dust." Evelyn's hands froze on the spool of thread she was holding, her throat tightening until she could scarcely breathe. Daniel did not seem to hear them, or perhaps he pretended not to, but their words sank deep all the same. On the way home, Evelyn kept silent, her eyes on the horizon where the mountains stood gray against the fading light. Daniel talked little, his focus on the reins, though he sensed her quiet and mistook it for weariness. When they reached the cabin, she slipped inside quickly, moving past him before he could offer a word. She set the thread on the table and busied herself at the stove, though her motions were sharp, her shoulders stiff. Daniel watched from the doorway, his brow furrowed, but chose not to press. He had learned she carried her burdens inward, and yet something in her silence gnawed at him. Days turned to weeks and the whispers grew louder. Supplies grew harder to come by. Neighbors who once nodded from their wagons now passed without greeting. Daniel bore it with the same grit he carried into every fight, but Evelyn felt the sting sharper than he did. She overheard a man at the blacksmith's mutter that the sheriff had lost his senses, taking in a woman marked by scandal. Another laughed that Hart's cabin would soon fall to ruin, cursed by her very presence. She stood in the shadows then, the words slicing like a blade she could not parry. That night she lay awake, staring at the low beams of the ceiling, her hand clutching the locket at her throat, the thought pressing down on her chest that she had ruined the man who had shown her kindness. By morning she moved slower, speaking less, her smile gone. She avoided the town, choosing to stay by the cabin, mending and cooking in silence. When Daniel asked if she was unwell, she only shook her head, unwilling to place her shame into words. He noticed the way she drew back from his touch, the way her laughter no longer came even at his quietest attempts. And though he did not yet know the cause, he felt the distance between them like a wall rising higher each day. The night was heavy with smoke, long before the flames reached the sky. Daniel had felt the unease all day, the way the air seemed to hum with trouble, and when the first shouts rang out from town, he knew the storm had broken. He saddled his horse fast, rifle across his shoulder, and Evelyn insisted on riding with him, though he told her to stay behind. Her eyes held no fear, only a steady light, and he did not waste time arguing as they galloped into the dark. By the time they reached the edge of town, the barn near the livery was already ablaze, fire licking up its timbers, sparks flying into the black sky. Men ran with buckets, women pulled children back into doorways, but the real danger came from the riders who circled in the street. Daniel recognized them at once, hard-eyed men with bandanas around their necks, their laughter harsh over the crackle of fire. These were no strangers. They were the same gang tied to Evelyn's late husband, the ones she had spoken of in shame and fear. His jaw clenched as he rode forward, his presence met with jeers. The leader, a broad man with a scar down his cheek, pointed his pistol toward Evelyn. "You've got something that belongs to us," he shouted, his voice thick with rage. "She knows where the money is hidden. That coward husband of hers never paid what he owed." Murmurs rippled through the townsfolk gathered in the shadows. eyes turning toward her with suspicion. Evelyn straightened in the saddle, her hand tight on the reins, her voice clear despite the roar of the flames. I have nothing of his, nothing but the shame he left me. Daniel swung down from his horse, placing himself between her and the gang. His voice carried, low and steady, the voice of a man who would not bend. You'll not touch her. Whatever debts your quarrel held, they died with him. The scarred man sneered, raising his pistol higher. You think one sheriff can stand against 6 armed men? Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. His body braced for a fight he knew he could not win alone. Evelyn's breath caught, fear striking deep. Yet in that moment, something stronger than fear rose in her. She remembered the way her husband's companions had boasted, the careless talk of their habits, their weakness for drink, and their arrogance in numbers. She slipped from the saddle and moved quick through the shadows, her skirts brushing dust. Daniel's eyes followed her, confusion flashing, but she gave him the smallest shake of her head. With a calm she did not feel, she called out to the leader, If you want your money, follow me, for only I know where he meant to keep it. Greed lit the man's eyes, and with a sharp command he urged his men after her, leaving Daniel momentarily forgotten. Evelyn led them toward the narrow alley between the smithy and the dry goods store, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew the path twisted and ended in a dead fence line, a place where horses could not turn fast and men would stumble in the dark. She darted through, skirts catching, while behind her the gang thundered after, cursing as they found themselves hemmed in. Daniel seized the chance, firing a shot into the air that scattered their mounts. The townsfolk, emboldened by his stand and Evelyn's quick thinking, surged forward with buckets and tools, striking at the trapped riders. Chaos burst. Smoke stung the air, but the gang faltered under the weight of resistance they had not expected. When at last the fire dimmed and the riders were driven out, Daniel found Evelyn leaning against the fence, breathless, her hands trembling but her chin lifted high. He caught her in his arms, his voice rough with relief. You risked your life. She looked up at him, eyes shining through the smoke. So did you. And together, though they were still shaking, they knew they had faced more than fire and bullets. They had faced the past that haunted them both, and for the first time, they had fought not alone, but side by side. The smoke still hung low over the town, drifting in thin gray ribbons that carried the sharp smell of charred wood. Buckets lay scattered in the street, water spilling into the dirt where the fire had been beaten down. The gang had fled into the night, their hoofbeats fading toward the hills, but the fear they brought lingered like a shadow. Daniel stood near the smoldering barn, his rifle hanging loose in his hand, his breath ragged. Only when the light caught his side did Evelyn see the dark stain spreading across his shirt. Her heart lurched, and she rushed to him, her fingers catching his arm before he could stumble. You are hurt, she said, her voice breaking, and though he tried to brush it aside, his knees weakened beneath him. He sank onto the steps of the mercantile, teeth clenched against the pain. Evelyn dropped beside him, her trembling hands pulling his coat open. The sight of blood soaking through the fabric made her throat close tight. She pressed her hand hard against the wound, whispering words she barely knew she spoke. I cannot lose you too, Daniel. Please, I cannot bear it. Her cheeks were wet before she realized she was crying, the tears streaking down as her hands tried to hold him together. Daniel looked at her through the haze of pain, the weight of her words cutting deeper than the wound itself. He had spent so long carrying only duty, keeping himself apart, believing there was nothing left in him to give but law and silence. Now, with her voice pleading, her touch steady, despite her trembling, he felt the walls he had built crack like glass. His hand lifted with effort and covered hers where she pressed against him, rough palm against her slender fingers. Evelyn, he whispered, his voice low and hoarse. You have given me something I thought I had lost. You've given me a reason to keep breathing beyond this badge. Her eyes widened, her breath catching at the confession. She had thought of him only as strength, as protection against a world that had always scorned her. But in his words, she heard the truth of what they had both found. She was not a burden to him, not a shadow of disgrace, but a partner who had reached into his loneliness and offered him something to hold. She leaned closer, her forehead brushing his as she whispered back, "Then you must keep fighting, because I am not finished standing beside you." The townsfolk moved around them, stamping out sparks and murmuring about the fire. But in that small space on the wooden steps, the world shrank to the two of them. His breathing steadied beneath her hand, his jaw relaxing as if her presence alone carried the strength he lacked. She bound the wound as best she could with strips torn from her apron, her hands gentle, her lips tight with determination. Daniel let her work, his eyes fixed on her face, the curve of her mouth drawn with courage, the glimmer of fierce resolve in her gaze. When at last the bleeding slowed and the night settled into uneasy quiet, he whispered again, softer than before, "You are not just shelter in this storm, Evelyn. You are the reason I know it's worth surviving." Her heart swelled at the words, fierce and tender, and she knew then what she had not dared admit. She had not found only protection in Daniel Hale. She had found a man who would walk beside her, a partner bound not by duty but by choice. And with the ashes of fire still drifting in the night air, that truth became the beginning of something neither of them could deny. The first snow of winter clung to the eaves of the cabins, softening the sharp lines of the town and muting the sound of wagon wheels on the frozen ground. Evelyn had gone into the mercantile for thread and flour, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. She kept her head low, moving with quiet purpose, but her ears caught voices drifting from the far side of the store, where men lingered by the barrel of nails. Their words came low and biting, yet clear enough to pierce through the shuffle of boots. "The marshal ought to hear of this," one said. "The sheriff taking in that widow, living with her as though his office means nothing." Another voice grumbled, agreement, rough with scorn. "A man charged with law should not be tangled with disgrace. If the marshal knew, he would strip the badge from Hale's chest." Evelyn froze, her hands clutching the bolt of cloth until her knuckles whitened. She willed herself not to turn, not to reveal that their poison had struck deep, but her breath came shallow as she listened. The men spoke of sending a petition, of gathering signatures, of shaming Daniel until the law itself cast him out. Each word cut like the lash of a whip, and when the shopkeeper turned to ask if she needed more flour, she managed only a stiff nod before setting her coins on the counter. Outside, the air bit sharper than before, and the snow seemed to glare in the weak sunlight. Evelyn walked quickly down the street, though her vision blurred with unshed tears. The whispers she had borne before were one thing, but this was more. This was not only her dignity at stake, but his livelihood, his very standing as sheriff. If the townsfolk turned their words into action, they could strip him of the only role that gave his life meaning, and she knew it would be because of her. When Daniel returned that evening, his boots heavy with snow, she greeted him with the same quiet warmth as always, ladling stew into his bowl and setting bread on the table. He spoke of patrols and the silence of the hills, his voice steady, but she found herself only half listening, her mind churning with the cruel words she had overheard. She forced a smile, careful not to let the weight of her fear show, and when he caught her gaze, she lowered her eyes to the table quickly. He seemed tired, lines cut deep into his face, and the thought that she might cost him the respect he had fought to earn pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. That night, while Daniel slept sound in the cot, with his arm draped loosely across the blanket, Evelyn sat awake by the hearth. The fire had burned low, casting the room in dim orange glow, and the silence felt sharper than the wind outside. She stared at her satchel resting near the chair, the same one she had carried from the wagon when she first arrived. Slowly, she pulled it closer, her fingers brushing the worn leather, her mind filled with plans she dared not speak. If she left quietly before dawn, he would wake to find her gone, spared from the disgrace the town pinned to her name. He could keep his badge, his honor, his place among them. Tears welled as she pressed the locket at her throat, whispering into the silence, "Better he hate me for leaving than lose all he has because I stayed." The fire popped softly, the only witness to her vow. She drew her shawl tighter, her heart heavy with resolve, already knowing that when morning came, she would choose the road rather than risk his ruin. The morning came pale and cold, the kind of morning when frost silvered the grass and the breath of every horse hung heavy in the air. Daniel rose early as always, pulling on his boots and reaching for his coat, but when he turned to fetch his gloves from the chair by the hearth, his eyes caught something that stopped him still: the satchel. It sat on the floor near the door, its flap buckled, its sides bulging with the neat fold of clothes. For a long moment he stared, his chest tightening, and then he picked it up, his jaw clenching hard enough to ache. Evelyn came from the kitchen, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and froze when she saw the satchel in his hand. Her face drained of color, her lips parting without words. Daniel's voice cut sharp, harsher than he intended. "You were leaving." She tried to speak, but only a broken sound came, her hands twisting in her skirt. He dropped the bag onto the table with a heavy thud. "Was it not enough, what we've faced together, that you'd run in the dark like a thief?" Tears filled her eyes as she stepped forward, her voice shaking. "I was trying to spare you, Daniel. The town means to petition the marshal. They want your badge, your name ruined, because of me. I could not let that happen." Her hands lifted as if to reach him, then fell back to her sides, trembling. "You've carried so much for them, for this place, and I will not be the reason they strip you of all you are." Daniel's heart twisted at her words, but his anger burned hotter than her fear. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Do you think I care more for their whispers than for you? Do you think I can lose you and still draw breath?" His eyes burned into hers, fierce and wounded. "You call it ruin, Evelyn, but you have been the only salvation I have known since my brother fell. Without you, this cabin is nothing but silence and dust. With you, it is life again." Her sob broke then, raw and full, her shoulders shaking as the tears ran unchecked. She pressed a hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold back all the years of shame, of loneliness, of waiting to be cast aside. Slowly, he reached for her, his hand closing around hers, pulling it away from her lips. His voice softened, though it still trembled. "Stay, not in shadows, not in shame. Stay, because I choose you, and I will choose you every day the sun rises over these hills." Evelyn looked into his eyes and saw no pity there, no hesitation, only a fierce devotion she had not believed could be hers. Her breath came uneven, but her words were clear. "Then I will stay, not hidden, not afraid. I will stay because I choose you too." Daniel drew her into his arms, holding her as though to prove he would never let her go. Outside, the frost began to melt under the pale sun, but inside the cabin, the warmth was strong and steady. Their choice was made, not against the town, not against fear, but for each other, openly and without shame. The snows melted slow that year, dripping from the eaves and soaking the earth until green shoots pushed through the thawed soil. By March, the air smelled of damp pine and wild grass, and the valley rang with the sound of birds returning. The sheriff's cabin, once quiet as a grave, now stirred each morning with the sound of Evelyn humming while she worked, her hands pressing seeds into the soft dirt of a garden plot by the porch. Daniel cut fence posts nearby, his steady rhythm of hammer and saw mixing with her laughter when a stubborn chicken pecked at her skirts. Where silence once ruled, the days now carried the music of life returning. Neighbors who had kept their distance through winter began to ride up again, drawn by the warmth they could not deny. Some came under the excuse of trading eggs or flour, others with the pretense of asking Daniel's advice. But their eyes softened when they saw Evelyn kneeling in the soil, her shawl cast aside, the sun warming her face. Children lingered by the porch rail to hear her gentle voice, and men who had once whispered of disgrace found themselves tipping hats in quiet respect. Daniel stood taller for it, not in pride, but in a peace he had not felt in years. In town, the shift showed itself more plainly. When Daniel walked down the main street with Evelyn on his arm, no longer did he lower his gaze or quicken his step. The marshal had not come to strip him of his badge, and the townsfolk, for all their gossip, could not deny what they saw with their own eyes. Daniel's voice carried steady when he spoke to the store clerk, and when the man called Evelyn by her maiden name, Daniel cut him short. "This is my wife, Mrs. Hale." The words fell with the weight of a vow, and Evelyn felt her cheeks flush as she met the eyes of those who listened. For the first time, she was not introduced as what she had lost, but as what she had become, a woman chosen and cherished. Back at the cabin that evening, Evelyn paused on the porch steps, her hand resting against her middle where new life stirred, faint but certain. The horizon stretched wide and golden before her, and Daniel joined her, his arms settling around her shoulders. They did not need to speak of the past anymore. The scars they bore were part of them, but no longer chains. The garden at her feet, the sound of cattle in the meadow, the warmth of his hand over hers, all spoke of a future built not on loss, but on hope. So their story closed not with silence, but with promise. A promise that out here, where land and sky stretched endless, love could take root even in the hardest ground. If this tale touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends, like, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Out on the frontier, every voice matters, though some roosters still believe they're the loudest storytellers in the yard.